Well, hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Provincial Association of Resort Communities of Saskatchewan's Lake Water Wednesdays. Tonight's presentation is by Dr. Peter Leavitt, who will speak on what controls water quality in our Saskatchewan lakes. So thank you for joining us tonight. Just a little bit of a reminder that next week, please join us again for Lake Water Wednesdays, as Jerry Geiger will be talking about invasive species. This webinar is being recorded, so please be mindful of that. If you have any questions, please hold them to the end or type them in the chat box, and I will forward them on to Peter at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn this over to Lynn Sass. Lynn is the coordinator of member services with Parks and organizer of Lake Water Wednesdays.
Hi, folks. Last week when we started Lake Water Wednesdays, I made it a point to introduce the lakes that are part of the Parks community. Parks is the Provincial Association of Resort Communities of Saskatchewan. And I pointed out at that time that our cottage communities are primarily south of the Evergreen Belt at the north of the province, the south 2/3 of the province, and that we have about 20 lakes across the north end of the southern part. And those are lakes that came to be under Canadian jurisdiction by Treaty 10 in 1906. And then down in the southeast part of the province, we have another 8 lakes, which came to be part of the Canadian jurisdiction by Treaty 4. And then on the southwest, right now, there's another 8 lakes. There weren't that many. There was a big river when they first came over. And that, like Treaty 4, that was Treaty 6, and that was in the late 1800s. So as I did it the first time, I make the point that we are grateful for the lakes that primarily came to us in a pristine and beautiful condition. And we do have concerns at this time about whether they have remained pristine and beautiful, and whether some of that may be our fault. And so we've called a renowned doctor to help us with this. When the patient is ill, you call for a doctor. And this Dr. Peter Leavitt is from the University of Regina, teaches in the biology department, a professor there, and also is very involved in the other aspects of water and the environment, and what is it that is making our water change. I personally am very anxious to hear the prognosis from the doctor. First, though, I will point out 2 things that happened just prior to these sessions. One happened in mid-April. I received a notice of the formation of the newly established Canada Water Agency, formed by the federal government. This 5-page letter outlined what they were about, and they started off by emphasizing that waters across our country are under threat. And I thought, well, that's putting it pretty clearly. And then not too long after that, I received a news release from the little newspaper called Discover Humboldt, stating that research findings about Humboldt Lake suggested that that lake was faced with a highly phosphoric rich content, that years of research and data gathering indicate that the nutrient contact in the lake had been increasing since the 1960s, and really went on to say that the lake was looking terminal, in different words, of course. And I thought, wow, there's 2 indications that we have lakes that are in terminal stages of development. It's all yours, Dr. Peter, to tell us why and what, if anything, we might do Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hi, folks. I'm talking to my computer from Northern Ireland right now. So if there's any hitches in this, it'll just be because we're in rural location and internet can be so-so. So what I was asked to do was to answer the question, what controls water quality in Saskatchewan lakes? And it's probably not quite as straightforward as that, in the sense that depending on where you are, lakes have different issues. But what I can do is I can tell you about some of the work that we've been doing in southern Saskatchewan, in mostly Treaty 4 territory, looking at the Qu'Appelle Lakes. And here's a picture here of Pasqua Lake, I believe, a sort of a south-facing shot on a calm day where everything's looking beautiful. First, I'd just like to start and again acknowledge that most of the research that we've done has been in Treaty 4 territory. The treaties were signed by First Nations in good faith to share the land with the new rivals. And I'd say we haven't done a very good job at respecting those treaties. And so in acknowledging the problems that have occurred for the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, as well as the Métis, I think we take a step towards reconciliation. And in the spirit of truth, we can go forward and work together and figure out how to solve some of the problems that face us together as a people. This work here is a summary of nearly 30 years of research that we've been doing. And so there's a lot of people and agencies that have contributed to this. And I'm just going to mention here that there's been federal and provincial and municipal funding agencies. There's been a lot of personnel that have come in through my lab and are now researchers elsewhere. And then there's been sources of data that have been collected by agencies, including the Water Security Agency here in Saskatchewan, that sort of helps interpret some of the things that we've been doing. So here's a nice picture of Buffalo Pound just as the ice is coming off. The thing that motivates me, what I'm curious about, is really why lakes change through time. Why are they beautiful and serene like this sometimes, and then they're covered with green scum other times? What are the causes that make lakes vary from one year to the next, or even from one season to the next, or even from one day to the next? This is a summary picture that basically has all the information that I've figured out in 30 years, and it's not very complicated. So basically the things that affect lakes are inputs of either energy, here in red, or matter, in blue. So when I'm talking about energy, I'm talking about light or radiance or heat, the temperature from the atmosphere, or the kinetic energy of wind that produces waves and causes lakes to mix from top to bottom or side to side. And we're talking about matter, we're talking about the inputs of water itself, precipitation, things that are dissolved in that water or suspended in the water, like particles or dissolved substances, and so basically the water itself. Now, what this means, though, is that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways of energy and matter to get in, and they can get in directly on the surface of the lake, or they can fall on the side of the lake and then trickle down. Now, these are the pathways by which the environment changes systems like lakes. They're also the pathways by which people affect lakes. The thing is, people don't really affect how sunny it is. We're having an effect on air temperature, but it's something that's occurring slowly. And we don't have much effect on wind. Where people have a big effect, though, is on the linkage between the land and the water. I'll make the point that water flows downhill. It interacts with people on the pathway, and what we do to the land and what we do to the water will eventually go downhill, downstream into the surface waters, be they creeks or lakes. The research at the University of Regina can be sort of split up into a couple of different areas. I mean, first, we look at long-term monitoring of water quality. This is a picture of you can almost tell my arm because there's no hair on it. A picture of water quality, in this case, Lake Mendota in Wisconsin. And that little round quarter disc that I'm holding Normally you set that down into the water and you measure the depth at which it disappears. And if the water's pretty clear, you can get it down 4, 5, 6 meters. If the water's less clear, you might only get it down a foot or so. In this case, Lake Mendota was having a significant bloom of algae. We had to hold it in sideways and you still couldn't see it. So water quality monitoring is one of the things that we do. And the reason you do monitoring is, you think, oh God, it's so boring. You just go out, you do the same thing time and time and time again. And the reason you do it time and time and time again is to measure things that take a long time to change, be that human populations or atmospheric temperature or the effects of fertilizer from farms. Most of these things take a while, if not decades, to show up. And so if you don't look for a while, you have no possibility of demonstrating their effect. The other thing that we try and do is reconstruct the past. And I'll get into this a little bit later by some examples. But basically what lives in the lake dies in the lake and it sinks down to the bottom and it forms a fossil record. So the mud's accumulated at the bottom of the lake. And you can take a tube and push it down into the sediments. And the deeper you go into the mud, the older the material is. And there's lots of technical ways of figuring out how old it is. But we're just finishing a project on Last Mountain Lake, Kanukama in Cree, or Long Lake to some people. And it's sort of in the center of the province. And we've got a sediment record, continuous sediment record that goes back 8,000 years. It wasn't that we in theory, could have gone back further. We ran out of pipe. That's as far as we could push the pipe in, was 8 meters. So now we're in the process of reconstructing the water quality for that lake for 8,000 years to see what the past tells us. And by understanding the present and the past, we're trying to forecast the future. We're trying to understand what's going on. And this is a very First Nations kind of way of looking at it. 7 generations in the past to understand the present, and using the past and the present to look 7 generations into the future about what the environment will be like at that time. The research at my institute, Institute of Environmental Change and Society, is basically looks at the reciprocal effects of people and the biophysical world, the environment. What do we do to the environment, and what does the environment do to us? And how do they interact? What are the direct effects? What are the indirect effects? Are there any things that are kind of surprises there back and forth? And so we're interested in environmental change and its interaction with society. And in particular, we're interested in it with respect to sustainable water resources. And so the research that we do basically is split up into 2 pathways. We have a pathway that leads through to climate change, and then a pathway that leads through to human activities. And in both of them, we have some indicator. We do some studies on what the past climate was to inform our current understanding. And then we have studies of the modern effects of climate on lakes to sort of forecast, okay, well, what will the future look like? Similarly, with human activities, we go back in time to see what the effects of starting agriculture were, or urban development might be. And then we use that to try and predict what we think the conditions are going to be like in the future. So this is my playground. It's the grasslands, the northern Great Plains, or we call them prairies here. You get the transition between the boreal forest, the boreal plains to the north, and the grasslands to the south, more long grass in the east, into mixed grass, into short grass as you move further and further to the west. These are the sorts of things that we've been looking at in the last few decades to give you an idea of how complicated it is and how the problems vary from location to location. Now, not all these problems are specific to where I've typed them. I just needed some room sometimes. But we've looked at water transfer in the Qu'Appelle Lakes. We are currently looking at changes in water quality in the Manitoba Great Lakes. We've looked at flooding in the Peace Athabasca Delta, effects of Alberta oil sands submission, climate effects, the effects of greenhouse gases, the effects of metal pollution, all these sorts of things. And the reason we look at all this is because that's how complicated the world actually is. And so we have a tendency to say, right, global warming, this is the big thing. If I was any good at technology, I'd make those letters really giant and sort of maybe an echo on top of them for dramatic effect. But failing that, I'll just point at climate. And these climate effects, they're really captivating everybody's attention right now. But in the past, we were more worried about the effects of excess nutrients, or maybe urbanization, or farming, or fish stocking, and so they all interacted. Some come to the fore and then fade away, and that sort of thing. So the specific area that I tend to work in is in the Qu'Appelle River catchment. There's an inset map here. The gray area sort of outlines. We're talking about a little over 58,000 square kilometers of mixed grass prairie for the most part. The main lake's flow of the water goes downhill, so it's higher in the west than the east, and you start with a source of water, either an artificial source, which is Lake Diefenbaker, a reservoir, or the natural source for the Qu'Appelle, which is wetlands and springs in around Highbrow Lake. And then the water moves down through 30-kilometer long Buffalo Pound Lake, bypasses Wascana Lake in the city, and Long Lake, Last Mountain Lake, until you hit the chain of what are called fishing lakes, which is Pasqua, Echo, Mission, and Katepwa. And then it continues down towards Manitoba, and you hit Crooked and Round Lake. And there's a lot of waterways and wetlands and smaller water bodies that are in this system. But these are the principal ones that my team have been studying. And what we've done is we've gone out to each of the lakes and measured as much as we could with the available resources. And so here's some inset pictures of the different lakes. You've got the big reservoirs, Diefenbaker, and small reservoirs, Wascana. You have very large natural shallow lakes, Last Mountain Lake. Now it's shallow, but it's only relatively shallow compared to its nearly 95-kilometer length. You've got towards the east a little bit more woodland area at the side of the lake. You have Crooked Lake there, Buffalo Pound, and then Pasqua Lake right in the middle. And Pasqua Lake's important because it's the first lake to receive wastewater from the city of Regina and Moose Jaw. And we've gone out, we've measured things like the physics and the chemistry. What's the temperature of the water? How much light is in the system? What are the nutrient levels like? Are the organic nutrients, inorganic nutrients? Is there oxygen in the system? And that sort of stuff. And then we've sampled the sediments as well. And then we've also looked at the biology, the invertebrates, the things that eat fish, the fish themselves, and the invertebrates that eat algae. What types of algae? Like little round green things that are in the water column. And we've done this, as I say, every 2 weeks during the summer, well, mostly during the summer, May through September, since 1994. And my background is that I did my PhD in Wisconsin, where there was a history of long lake monitoring as well as lake experimentation. Then I did a postdoc at the Experimental Lakes area near Kenora, which is part of the Freshwater Institute based in Winnipeg. Then I went to Alberta, and I worked with David Schindler, who was my postdoctoral supervisor, and he was one of the really instrumental people in understanding modern lake process. He recently passed on just on March 4th. And then I ended up in Regina. And since then, I've tried to take the best parts of each of my experiences in other locations and build something that would be credible as a scientific exercise relative to the places I've been at. And since I've been at good places, I'm setting the bar pretty high to do this right. So we go out to the lakes, and if you're ever out and you see this kind of weird little inflatable boats, that'll be us, 6 horsepower motor, 4-stroke motor. It used to be 2 strokes, but they leak oil, so now they're 4 strokes, nice and heavy with no power at all. And we'll get up on the water and get up on step and go to the middle of the lakes and one of the basins and sample the center of the lake. We also do sampling around the near shore and the stream areas to get an idea of the linkage between creeks and the lakes that they feed in. And we take the water back to the lab, excuse me, and we'll do different experiments. Here's an incubation to measure the productivity of the system. We measure how much oxygen is produced in the light or how much is consumed in the dark. And we use that to figure out how fast the water is getting green, the rate of primary production. We'll filter water. Oh, filtration towers. Oh, they're so lovely. That's about $1,500 worth of science equipment. Hard pressed to believe it. It's just a metal tower. At any rate, you put a little filter on it, and you let the water pass through the filter, which is held in a clamp right here, and then you collect what's on it, and you do the analysis of that. Here's a couple of people doing some of the analysis in the lab, and more or less everybody enjoys what they're doing. It's the kind of thing that, you know, the ad reads, come out and be on the lake all summer long, and they're, oh, everybody's fantastic about that. We maybe don't mention that you're going to spend a lot of time sitting behind a microscope picking out little invertebrates from scummy algal water, but that's life. It's not false advertising precisely, it's just not full disclosure, shall we say. We also use the sediments, as I said, to go back in time, using the law of superposition, which is deeper is older, basically. And in the sediments, you'll see little remains, fossils of different algae. Here's a diatom that's very common in many prairie lakes, pretty much all prairie lakes. And you can look through the different layers in the lake and use these changes in species composition to tell us about historical changes in water quality. And here's a reconstruction of how salty the water was near Chauvin towards the Alberta border, just pretty much, excuse me, east and slightly south of Saskatoon, right on the border. And you can see periods, this is a 2,000-year record, and you can see there's a period of 500 years where the lake was half the saltiness of the ocean. And then there's been up and down, and go to a crescendo right around the time Treaty 4 was signed. And then the last 100 years has been amongst the wettest or the freshest water quality of the last 2,000 years. And so when we're thinking about now, you also have to think about what it was like in the past. And so that's the reason you use the fossil records to get an idea of what the past looked like, and therefore to inform you of what the future might look like. And it's also awesome for putting pictures of yourself up on the web and thinking, that little kid, he was pretty cute, but what happened in the middle? And my goodness, is that actually the same guy? And are those really his teeth? Yes, they are. So you know, this is the idea: is there's transitions which might be invisible to you as you move through them, but which nonetheless exist. And so you use the sediments to get a better idea of what the past was. A lot of the work we do is in the Institute of Environmental Change and Society, in the limnology lab. It's not the study of arms and legs, limbs, it's LIMNO, which is derived from the word for water. And limnology is the study of inland waters, be they creeks or wetlands or lakes, whether they're fresh or salty, bogs, whatever. That's the domain that we work in, is inland waters. And the Institute is on the 5th floor of the reasonably newly constructed Research Innovation Center at the University of Regina. And that just gives you sort of a picture in the lab when there's nobody there. And it's a nice sort of fall day, I would look. You know, there's tons of equipment here that allows you to do all sorts of analyses about things that might be problems for the environment. So we've got instruments that tell us about greenhouse gas emissions, how green the water is, what the nutrient concentration is, and even where the water comes from. We can fingerprint the water and ask it, are you from snow or are you from rain? And it matters. So there's lots of good opportunities here to do research. What I'm going to do in the time that I've got, and I'm just going to keep an eye on the time here. I better move through a little quicker than I'm moving. Is I'm going to tell you 2, maybe 3 little stories. First, I'm going to tell you about the pollution of the Qu'Appelle River system, and this is basically talking to you about the system that I spent the most time on. I'm going to talk about climate change and then future challenges to our system. So here's the problem. Most of our prairie lakes are too green, and there's a lot of reasons. They're alkaline, which favors a type of algae called cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. They're very nutrient rich, lots of nitrogen and phosphorus. If you like your fertilizers, you'll recognize these names. And the ratios of these, there typically is too much phosphorus, and that produces this sort of blue-green scum on the top of the lakes. And the main players in this story are Annie, Fanny, and Mike. And these are 3 of the very common cyanobacteria. Annie at the top is Anabina, and it often forms a well-mixed community in the lake that gives it a sort of a gray-green cast or color. Fanny is a Phanasomenon. There'll be no quiz at the end on how to pronounce that. A phenomenon it forms little fine filaments, but they aggregate together. They're kind of stuck together, and they look like somebody's cut their lawn and then dumped the grass blade clippings in the lake. And so this is the grass blade form of the colony. And then Mike is microcystis, and this is Mike's not a good guy. Mike has a lot of cellular toxins in him and creates the problems. And so it often looks like this poured on paint on the lakes that gets up on the sand. And this is the toxins that it produces are not terrific for livestock or animals. And while they don't cause immediate human concerns, they are certainly hepatotoxins. They cause liver dysfunction, and they've been implicated as carcinogens. Although truthfully, you'd have to drink an awful lot of water to get a high enough dose, and most people don't do that. Livestock, different story, but we'll move past that. So when I first got here, and I appreciate this is a busy slide, but I'll step you through it slowly. When I first got here, I thought, okay, I'm flying into, or actually I drove from Edmonton to here, and it's a pretty good drive, and there's a lot of farmland between now and there, and you got to start to think, I wonder if farming had much to do with water quality in the system. So the very first thing we did is we took the sediments from all the lakes in the Qu'Appelle, and we pushed a tube down into each of them and then analyzed the tubes and said, how has the nutrient input and the amount of algae changed over the last 300 years? And here's the plot for some of the lakes, and the western lakes here, generally speaking, headwater lakes or upstream lakes, and then the downstream lakes here. The difference is this black one, which is Pasqua Lake, which is the first one to receive wastewater from the city of Regina. And what you see is in Last Mountain Lake or Buffalo Pound, or even Wascana, the reservoir, there's very little change, and there's virtually no index or change at the onset of farming in the 1890s. Farming just didn't make that much of a difference, at least early on. If you look at the total amount of algae in Pasqua Lake, you can see it maybe steps up a little bit as farming starts, but it's really later that the story gets worse. And that's true if you look at the cyanobacteria. It's there, it's always there. The lakes have been green, but they become a little greener after farming and then a lot greener later on. And by comparing the lakes that don't receive wastewater, that's these lightly shaded ones, with the lakes that do directly or indirectly receive wastewater, you can see that there's quite a big change in nutrient inputs. And this is basically just a plot of the amount of nutrients as a function of time, or the amount of algae as a function of time. So the take-home story here is, while you'd expect farming to have a really big effect early on in the last century or two, there's just not that much evidence for it. So it wasn't so much that we're ignoring farming. We simply think that at the start, it wasn't the main story. The main story was urban pollution. And over the last 50 years, we've been able to see that wastewater from the city centers has been a main factor degrading water quality. And in the Qu'Appelle system, you've got the city of Regina, which is just a little under 250,000 people with outlying areas, and Wascana Creek in this light blue comes through the city, picks up the wastewater at the wastewater treatment plant, then goes down, does a quick turn here as it enters the Qu'Appelle River near the town of Lumsden, and then moves down through the Qu'Appelle until it gets to Pasqua Lake. Sometimes the water is managed and shunted up to Last Mountain Lake here, but for the most part, by volume, most of the water goes down to Pasqua. So we might expect that the effects of cities to be strongest in Pasqua Lake, and we did quite a lot of research on that. And the types of research we do, in this case in Wascana Lake itself, with the support of the city of Regina and the province, we just did a bunch of experiments over the course of several years. We just basically take part of the lake and put it in a bag, and then add nutrients into the bag and say which nutrients have an effect. And so in the old pictures worth 1,000 words, here you go. You've got the water if you do absolutely nothing to it. You've got the water if you add only phosphorus. And the camera makes it look like it's clearer with the phosphorus than under normal conditions. It's just kind of a cloud cover issue. But when you add nitrogen into the system, you can see immediately that it's greener. There's surface scums of the same sort of cyanobacteria that you see. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the lakes, at least Wascana Lake and the downstream lakes, are very susceptible to the inputs of nitrogen. So that made us think, all right, well, do we see any evidence of this? And for that, we went back into the past and we took this tube of sediments and we analyzed the individual layers in it. We measured using chemical means the degree of nitrogen pollution. We measured how green the water had become through time. And this is the relationship. It's noisy, but at the start of the record, some 200 years ago, before Treaty 4, you had the least amount of pollution and the least amount of greenness. And then as the pollution has increased, you've been generally tracked upward until now you've got the maximum amount of pollution and the maximum amount of greenness. Now, what we also found in those little bag experiments was that as you add more nitrogen pollution, you also get more toxic algae. And so the reason's a little bit complicated, but basically when the algae pick up nitrogen, one of the things they do with it is they shuffle it around and they take it on board and they use it to produce proteins and stuff like that, but they also use it to produce toxins. And so when you measure the amount of these toxins that are produced by the scum, now this is a kind of complicated figure, but this is basically the drainage area for the Qu'Appelle. I've left off Diefenbaker, but you've got Buffalo Pound leading into Pasqua, Kitepwa, and Crooked. And then at the sides, at the top and bottom, you have Last Mountain Lake and Wascana. And then in each of these little panels, you've got some concentration or pattern of concentration of toxins, this microcystis, which is a toxin found in some cyanobacteria. And if the line's dark, that's how much concentration there was in the past. And if the light is lighter blue, that's how much concentration of toxin there is at present. And you can see, generally speaking, the light lines are higher than the dark lines. And what that means is there's scums of toxin producing algae in these lakes, and that they're generally speaking getting worse. The light dashed line here is the drinking water advisory. In other words, you can't really shouldn't drink the water without processing. Probably a good idea anyway, but this gives you some idea of where that threshold is. And then the dark line is if the blue line gets above this dark red line, that means that you're not really supposed to recreate in the water. That's a recreational advisory. And you can see that Buffalo Pound is the drinking water reservoir for the city of Regina, and Pasqua Lake has Pasqua First Nations, and it's just immediately upstream of Fort Qu'Appelle. And so here's two areas that have a lot of human activity associated with them, and they're both approaching contact advisories. And it's worse in the last couple of years than it was earlier in the record. And so this is reason for concern. And you mentioned that the resort communities are spread out through the province, and I admit I don't have much information from the northern part of the province. The work we've done there has mostly been with flood history in the East Athabasca Delta and the effects of the oil sands sort of mid-province. But when we've surveyed lakes in southern Saskatchewan, we've surveyed 100 lakes. We do this about once every 5 or 10 years. We're actually due for another survey. This one is from 2013. We went to 100 lakes in southern Saskatchewan, indicated with crosses, and we measured the amount of toxins. And so on this map on the right, we've just colored it in. We've made the bubble as big as the amount of toxin, and then we've sort of overlaid the color to indicate the concentration. So according to this scale bar, is anything green or above has problems with drinking water, and anything with blue or above has problems with contact advisories. And you can see almost all of the map is green, meaning that a lot of the lakes in the southern part of the province have issues with water quality relating to these blue-green algae and the toxins they produce. So what do you do about it? You know, well, the thing you do is you try and figure out what the main sources of nutrients are. As I mentioned earlier, it's the nitrogen in the Qu'Appelle system that causes the problem. The more nitrogen that comes in, the more algae you get. The more algae you get, the more cyanobacteria you have. The more cyanobacteria you have, the more toxins you have. So what you need to do then is you need to get rid of the nutrients. And the city of Regina took the big step of constructing a new wastewater treatment plant that largely removes nitrogen from the waste stream. Not entirely, but it gets rid of the ammonia, which is a particularly toxic form that is favored by the cyanobacteria. and instead it reduces both nitrogen and phosphorus by a substantial amount. And so we want to know, well, okay, the upgrade was in 2017. What effect was there? So to do that, we measured the concentration of nutrients and algae and toxins. I don't think we did actually. Nutrient and algae all the way down Wascana Creek, pretty much to Pasqua Lake, while we were also measuring Pasqua Lake. And we did this for 4 years really, from 2017 onwards. Again, I'm trying to summarize a lot of complicated data with a few pictures, and the pictures don't always work, but basically in the headwaters of Wascana Creek, before you get wastewater in, the water tends to be turbid or cloudy, and there's many suspended cyanobacteria. So the natural condition of the catchment, or the condition of the modern catchment, is one with lots of these cyanobacteria in the creek. Immediately downstream of the city of Regina, though, you see the water is actually clear, and while it looks like it's sort of dark blue, it's actually dark green, and this is because of algae growing on the rocks, because the light now penetrates all the way down to the bottom. So you have relatively clear water and very few suspended cyanobacteria. Then when you get back down into the Qu'Appelle, further downstream, 70 kilometers down from the city, you see the water is once again this sort of turbid or cloudy condition, and there's a lot of cyanobacteria. So there's a very clear effect of the wastewater treatment that makes the conditions in the stream move from cyanobacteria rich or cloudy to relatively clear with lots of nice green algae growing on the bottom. So this is a win. But it should be a win because creeks don't store nutrients. They basically flush through the system. They should respond very quickly, and Wascana Creek has responded quickly to the wastewater upgrade. Statistically, you can look at the relationship between the amount of algae and the amount of wastewater nitrogen, and you see basically now that the effects of the wastewater are diminishing through time as we're affecting the nutrient release by the city. We're getting more benthic algae, we're getting less suspended algae in Wascana Creek, and that gives us a pretty good idea of what the mechanism is. And I won't get into too much details other than to say that these are really clear patterns, that unusually clear, that you see in the environment. So what's downstream? Wascana Creek runs into the Qu'Appelle. The Qu'Appelle runs into Pasqua Lake. Do we see any effect of the wastewater upgrade in the lake? And here's the story is still playing out. So far, not that much evidence of a change. We lower this disc down into the water. This is what's called a Secchi disc, named after the Italian who invented it. And if we can see it down really deep, then the water's clear. 5 meters down, that's really clear. And if the water's cloudy, we can barely get it wet, and it disappears. And so these are time series or records since 1994 to about 2018. But I will say the story is not that much different in the last couple of years. And for all the lakes, like Diefenbaker, Buffalo Pound, Pasqua, Qu'Appelle, Crooked, and then Last Mountain and Wascana on the sides. And again, these are the lakes that we've monitored more or less for 25 plus years, slightly less in Wascana and Pasqua. So the things that you see are, well, some lakes are really clear. Diefenbaker's always got water clarity. It's in around 3 meters. You can see that disc down. And that means light penetrates about 6 meters deep into the lake, which is a really good value. Whereas other ones like Wascana Lake, you can barely get 50 centimeters. Buffalo Pound, really around a meter. And then it gets maybe slightly better as you move downstream, but not noticeably. The key thing is the red dashed line is the onset of wastewater treatment. And you can see that the water's not really become much clearer as a result, at least initially, of the wastewater diversion. When we look at how much of the algae is floating as a scum on the surface, and we just do a ratio of how much is in the surface versus how much is all the way through the water column, and that's what this figure presents. There is a tendency to see that there seems to be more scum on the surface as a result of the wastewater, but actually what you can see is this is part of a long-term, nearly decade-long trend to higher scumminess, and that it also occurs in lakes that are well downstream or which receive relatively little nutrients. What that tells us is this is not due to wastewater, but rather due to regional climate. And as you'll see in the next little slide, it's mostly due to climate warming. So we see there's 3 to 6 times more algae in Wascana due to urban pollution with nitrogen. We found out that the city was the main source of nutrients and that it was producing toxic algae, and that the recovery of the lakes is ongoing. Now, we are concerned because of that last little bit that I told you. The global warming is going to make it harder for the lakes to recover. And basically, the cyanobacteria, the blooms, like it hot. The warmer the water, the better they do. And so what I want to do in this next little bit is talk a little bit about the effects of climate change and some of the work we've done to try and compare climate change with the nutrients. And again, we're talking about the Qu'Appelle Valley, large drainage area, lots of lakes that we monitor on a regular basis, and then a lot of climate stations that we can use. Here are the gold stars that we can use to measure changes in the environment and then compare those with changes in the water quality. And the things we looked at were, basically how green was the water, what's the total amount of algae, and what fraction of it are in surface scums. We wanted to know whether the water was clear. Could we see that disk all the way down, or was it just at the surface? And then was there any evidence of toxic species that we needed to worry about? And we basically asked, what's most important? Is it climate? Is it meteorology or local weather? Is it in-lake conditions? Or is it something to do with the flow of water? You'll often hear the phrase, the solution to pollution is dilution. And the question is that actually true? So these are the sorts of results we get. There's 3 panels here. There's how green is the water and how has that changed through time for each of the lakes that we study. How clear is the water and how has that changed through time? And how many of these potentially toxic cyanobacteria have there been? And there's some pretty straightforward take-home messages here. First, things have not actually changed that noticeably in the last 25 years. In some lakes, there's a very slight increase. In other lakes, there's a slight decrease. We can see that there are large differences among lakes. The Diefenbaker is always the clearest lake. Wascana, perhaps Buffalo Pound, tend to be the least clear lakes. And those patterns, they do vary through time, but they don't vary an enormous amount. So if they do change, that's an early warning indicator. And then we see some evidence of cycles or periods where the cyanobacteria seem to take off some years and then be relatively unimportant others. And this is important because some of these cycles are related to things like climate systems like ENSO or the El Nino system. Typically, if we've had a year with a lot of runoff, the blooms tend to be quite a bit worse. And so how much snow we get in a winter can be an important feature in driving the nutrients from farms into the lakes. When you want to ask what's the most important thing affecting the greenness of the water, how clear it is, whether there's a surface scum or whether there are cyanobacteria, it turns out the controls are both complicated, that is, there's many things, complex, I should say, there's many things that have an effect, but they also vary depending on what your question is. If you want to know why there's so many cyanobacteria, well, wind is important, temperature seems to be very important, and then climatic conditions like precipitation can be important. Whereas when you're looking at whether there is clear water, it's a different thing altogether. There's more about inflow, there's a little bit on climate, but there's quite a bit on how much algae are already in the system. And so this makes it difficult to forecast. So we took all this information and we modeled it. We basically said, what are the relationships between climate warming, nutrients, and water flow, and how will they change in the future? And so when you do that, you get these sorts of relationships. So this is basically how much greener will the water get when it's 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree, or 5 degrees warmer than at present. And there's 3 bars. There's a bright green bar for total algae. There's a sort of a gray-green for scum. And then there's a small bar of dark green, which is for water clarity. And what you get out of this is that based on the last 25 years, 30 years of sampling, temperature is going to have an enormous effect. As it gets warmer, you're going to get more algae and you get more surface scums. And that's because the cyanobacteria really love this. it doesn't really affect the water quality that much. But it affects where the greenness is growing, and it's growing up the surface, and then you're getting more of it. If you do the same sort of analysis with the nutrient contents of the lake, you see a different pattern. So as you remove, well, if you have 300% of the current nutrients down to 50%, down to 10%, you see a decline in the greenness of the algae, or the greenness of the lakes, and the proportion of nutrients, or the proportion of surface scum. So what that means is if you reduce the nutrient input, you will get less algae. So you get two things going on here. You've got more algae if it gets warmer, and you've got less algae if there's more nutrient diversion or better processing of nutrients. The thing that was surprising to us is that there's almost no effect of water flow through the Qu'Appelle system. That you get maybe a 5 or 10% change in the total amount of algae or the surface scum, with nearly a 200% change in flow, either down or up. And to have substantial dilution of the system, you need to basically eliminate, you need to put 10 times more water through the creek than currently goes through. And that's more than the river channel can actually hold. So that is not an option. To sort of look at this then from a management perspective, in terms of water temperature, it has a big effect on water quality. As it gets warmer, we're going to have more problems with cyanobacteria. We're going to have more problems with algae. The outlook from a management perspective isn't great because good luck controlling air temperature, at least from a management perspective. Inflow has almost no influence on water quality, at least in the range that we looked at. And so there's really limited capacity for managers to fix the problem by moving more or less water through the system. And I should say the reason for this is the nutrients in the lake that have accumulated over hundreds of years have ended up in the bottom of the lake in the mud. And the mud is now basically the main nutrient source to the lake. So if you put a little water through or a lot of water through, it doesn't have that much effect on how much nutrients are coming out of the mud. And then in the sort of the intermediate range, restricting nutrients has a moderate effect on water quality. Not quite as strong maybe as temperature, but it's also manageable. It's expensive, as the wastewater upgrade showed for the city of Regina, but it is something we can control. So for climate, we see that clarity and greenness is controlled by temperature, water flow, and nutrients, but warm water is going to make it worse. Nutrient removal or wastewater treatment makes it better, and that includes farms and septic fields and that. And the river flow is not that big a deal. So, surprise child. This is off of the web, not my kid. There's a lot of us, and there's getting to be more of us. And as we get to be more and more dense of a population, we'll have more and more effect on the climate system and more effect on pollution. And as a result, you start to have things that occur that you don't expect. And I'll kind of finish up with this. One of these sort of surprises, these ecological surprises, had occurred just this last spring in Pasqua and secondarily Echo Lake, in which you had this incredibly dark blue. It's kind of attractive, actually, blue water. And there's a little inset photo. This is a photo on the north shore of Pasqua Lake, at the sort of in the middle of the lake. This is looking down a fishing hole, and this is the same water where we filtered out everything. We just brought into the lab. So that's a cup of clear water, and that's the Pasqua Lake water. You can see it is definitely stained. It's discolored blue. And people were quite rightly freaked out about this. It's like, is it somebody dumping their antifreeze? Is that a leaked septic system? Because it kind of looks like tidy bowl or toilet cleaner. It's just a little bit disconcerting. It turns out it's neither of those. It turns out it's the water-soluble pigment from the scum of the algae that occurred in the lake in the fall of the previous year, so fall of 2020. If you take this water out of the lake and you filter it, you see this very, very sharp increase in absorbance of light as a function of the type of light that you shine it. This dark line here is a sample from the middle of the lake, and this is the blue water sample, and you can see very, very clear difference in the types of light that's absorbed. And this is basically, if you absorb a light in this character of light, the water will appear blue. The thing is, though, as I said, we took this water and we filtered it out. And what we did is we analyzed that filter to say, who lives there? Who's there? And it turns out that the markers that we found in those samples were from the exact cyanobacteria that occurred in the lakes in the fall. So what this told us, we knew these algae had this blue color pigment which dissolved in water. We knew these algae had these lipid soluble pigments which were stayed with the particles. And so this really suggested that what we'd had is a condition in the fall in which we had an enormous amount of algae that was trapped and their pigments were released into the ice. So what we did is we made friends with remote sensing scientists, and we asked them to look at Pasqua Lake here in the top and scan it for the presence of blue ice, and then scan it for the previous presence of algae. So the top one is from the 5th of April, and in this particular case, anything that's red is absorbing those wavelengths and appears blue. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. The redder it is, the bluer the ice was supposed to be. So we had 4 samples. We had a Camp Luther Land sample. We had a sample on Pasqua Lake, and then another one towards the middle of the basin. And then we had a reference site out in the middle. You'll notice that all our sampling sites are brown or red, suggesting that they have blue ice, and it's showing up in the satellite image. But the really cool thing is, if you look at the fall, this is November, you've already lost a bit of the lake due to ice formation. You can see that the red bit, which is the high concentration of cyanobacteria, is just around the margin of the lake. So as the ice is forming, you have an accumulation of these algae. So again, these are the shore of the lake. This is the outlet of Echo Lake, which is basically the same as the outlet of Pasqua. You see these accumulations of these algae. They freeze into the ice, and by spring, the pigments are released, and you get this weird blue water. Now, everybody's kind of freaked out. And they're going, oh, yes, but it's blue. It's terrible. The good news, such as it is this is relatively non-toxic. By that, I mean the pigment, which is something called phycocyanin C, is actually an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, approved food colorant. You can buy it in Dad's Organics in Regina. You can get it online. Here's blue spirulina, a type of blue-green algae related to the ones that we see in the lake. And you'll notice that color is really the same color as we saw in the water column. So we've kind of nailed down what the problem, what the cause is. But sort of worryingly at the bottom of this is that there is, this hadn't occurred before, so we're a little bit worried about that. To finish off then, I'm just going to point out that there are other things that we need to worry about. Southern Saskatchewan currently has the potential, if not the occurrence, of invasive species such as zebra and quagga mussels. We have issues relating to water diversion. We have industrial extractions for solute mines, potash mines. And then we have a rise in fracking. And each of these things is incredibly important and is something that we need to get ahead of if we're to protect the water in the system. So we have lots of invasive species. Many of them are not in the province, but they're surrounding us entirely here for zebra mussels in red. And so we need to get ahead of that curve. We know that there's problems with water level rises, possibly due to climate change, possibly due to farm drainage. We have very few options to move the water around. And so if we do move the water around, there's consequences. So if we diverted water, say, out of the Quill Lakes into Last Mountain Lake, you'd add approximately 50,000 metric tons of salt per year into this little basin here. It will have a tremendous effect in a national wildlife area. You have extractions of salt. There's proposed and actual mines surrounding the city of Regina, and all of these need fresh water for their mining activities, and there are limited sources of fresh water, and therefore there's stresses. And there's effects of the potash mines. If you're going to take the water out of the lakes, then you can expect changes in lake level. You have the potential for loss of habitat and effects on endangered species. And then you have waste salt that accumulates in the environment in large areas around the mines And if there's a lot of mines, you have an area that is primed to be leaking salt. And so these are things you need to worry about. And then finally, with fracking, hydraulic fracturing or fracking uses surface water, injects chemicals into it, and under pressure uses it to fracture the substrate and extract oil-bearing petroleum products from oil-bearing rocks. We've seen a growth in oil production in Saskatchewan over the last 50 years, but recently, after a long plateau, there's been a big step up, and that step up is due to an explosion of fracking wells, going from some 63 wells in southern Saskatchewan by 1990 to nearly 8,000 wells by 2015, and it's increasing given the importance of the revenue from these oil and gas wells. We can expect that exploration will continue, and so fracking will continue to use surface waters. I'll finish up with this slide. There's lots of things we can do. Being involved, such as you are here, being cognizant of the past, trying to understand how the modern condition is affected by historical conditions, and then forecast what the future was going to look like based on how things have changed in the last decades to even centuries. Get ahead of the problem. Be aware of industrial practices. Consider your own personal activities and what you can do to improve them and reduce pollution. And then get involved. There's citizen science groups. Kerry Finley runs a group out of the University of Regina. Support First Nations treaties. The treaties are for everybody. They do protect the environment. And so there's lots of things we can do to make this more of a good news story and less bad news. So I'll finish up there. Just to remind you that clean water is a human right, and it's something that we should all take seriously because our kids' futures depend on it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great talk. We do have a few questions that people have typed in. I will tell you, if you have a question and would like to speak, just put up your hand, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get through to everybody. I know there was a couple comments initially about the sound or the audio sort of coming in and out, and I think that's just because of Peter's connection over in the UK. He's not in Canada today, so apologize for that. So anyways, the first question here we have is from Joan, and she's wondering about what effects of the many cottage developments and golf courses around Lake Diefenbaker has multiplied the amount of inputs human activity immediately adjacent to the lake. What effect does that have, and has there been any studies on that?
Well, I can talk to you of how the water quality has changed in Lake Diefenbaker, John. Diefenbaker is getting progressively greener, and it is becoming less suitable for big game fish habitat. I'll explain that a little bit. So we've been monitoring the Qu'Appelle Arm since 1994, and then we've done sediment studies in Diefenbaker from the time the reservoir was established. And generally speaking, the Gardner Arm and the Qu'Appelle Arm have become notably greener really since the reservoir is formed. Part of this is the natural response of terrestrial lands to being flooded. It's something called a trophic or food web surge. When you flood land, a lot of the inundated land releases nutrients into the water, and it does so for decades. And it takes a while for everything to kind of come into steady state where inputs and outputs are in balance. And it takes a while for the lakes to get greener, but they do. In terms of the cottaging and the land use immediately adjacent to the lake, any lake that you modify the nearshore environment has the potential to increase the nutrient input. As I mentioned, water runs downhill, and people like to build right beside lakes. And so there's almost no buffer between human activities and the water itself. So people have to be aware of this and be very careful about making sure their septic fields are up to code and that they're not releasing nutrients. Ideally, that they don't have a septic field, that they have a septic tank that's pumped out. That's the optimal solution. If they've got a lawn, do you really need to fertilize the lawn? Because if you do, the excess nutrient will end up in the lake and it'll make the lake greener. The application of pesticides, again, the pesticides get into the water, run downhill into the lake, and can affect non-target species. So maybe you don't like your dandelions, but maybe it knocks out a type of algae that you would prefer to be in the lake and favors a type of algae that you wouldn't want. So anytime that we get in close to the lake margin, you've got to be aware that the lake margin actually acts like a buffer or a sponge to soak up things that are coming from land into the water. And so if we adjust that sponge, if we mess up its function, it can have an effect on the water quality. So I should say I can't answer the specifics about whether there has been a study of individual communities. I'm speaking more in general terms of what happens with the average lake.
Great. Okay, next question is from John. Do you consider farm fertilizers as the greatest nutrient input into Saskatchewan lakes?
It would really depend on which lake you're talking about and what the activity is around. I mean, it's pretty easy to figure out, scientifically it's easy. You do what's called a mass budget. It's like a bank balance. What's going in, what's going out, and who are the biggest streams in and out. And you can figure out quite quickly whether it's farming or whether it's intensive livestock, whether it's an urban, even small urban centers like Fort Qu'Appelle. And there was a discussion earlier about Humboldt Lake. We actually did the analysis of Humboldt Lake. We did the sediment analysis, and we could show pretty much unambiguously that the lake has been receiving wastewater and that the wastewater is making the lake greener. There's just no question about it. So it depends a little bit on what the background levels of nutrients are and what the main activities are. What I will say is the effects of agriculture tend to accumulate very slowly and are often invisible as you're going along. So I mentioned earlier on that we didn't see much evidence of farming effects early in the record, sort of the start of the 20th century. But, you know, we've controlled a lot of the point sources, a lot of the big ones. Moose Jaw's got a good wastewater treatment plant, or at least decent. Regina's got a state-of-the-art one, so does Saskatoon. Other towns are thinking about getting on board. It's not that the problem's solved, but we're certainly headed in the right direction. We've been less successful with land use practices. Anytime that you add in more fertilizer than the crops require, it will end up in the water, and it will run into the creeks and into the lakes. So there is the high potential for that to be a really serious problem. So I realize I'm not truly waffling on this. It's just, I think it is an important issue. It's been hidden in the last century, and we're starting to see maybe some evidence now that we can't avoid it. And so the way to think of it is this: let's say you put in just the perfect amount of nutrients to your farms, except that you're off by 0.5%. 0.5%, who cares? It's nothing. But 99.5% perfect, good enough. Except that if you multiply that by 100 years, all of a sudden it's 50%, not 0.5%. And now it is a big issue. So I think the difficulty is when you do short-term studies, you can't always see these longer-term aggregate effects. And I think now we're starting to see evidence of aggregate effects of nutrient management in livestock and in farming.
Good. Okay, next question. What are your thoughts? Oh, I just lost it here. Sorry. For the last several years, the clarity of Qu'Appelle Lake has taken on a brown tea-like color. Is that a type of algae?
Well, it can be. I don't think it is. What we have noticed in all the Qu'Appelle lakes is that the amount of colored dissolved organic matter, literally the tea color, has increased. It's increased about I don't think the unit's going to mean that much, but about 1 milligram a liter. So a really strong cup of tea would have maybe 15 milligrams of dissolved organic matter in it, and clear water would have 0. So 1 milligram a liter is, you can see that the water's slightly stained, but it's not really remarkable. And it's taken about 15 years to see that change. So I think it's unlikely that the brownness right now, if it's just in the last couple of years, is due to that, but it's certainly going to be a contributing feature. Another thing that can have a difference is the type of algae. There is a type of cyanobacteria called Gliatrichia that looks like little burrs or fur balls. And it can be quite brown, and it tends to float. And so we used to see it a lot on Last Mountain Lake, less so in recent years, but it is possible that would be the case. I mean, I don't have any thoughts on it, but if it's something that you think has gotten worse, we can look into the record and see if we can find any evidence of it. Right at this particular juncture, I don't think it's anything to be concerned about, but it would be something that I could look into.
Good. So next question is from Anson. What are your thoughts about bioaugmentation as remediation option for HAB and cyanotoxin?
Philosophically, I'm opposed to adding anything to get at a problem that is due to adding something else, if that makes any sense. So I don't think the solution to the problem is to add more stuff. I think the solution to the problem is to add less stuff, less nutrients. I think if you're looking at technical responses, and I will say I don't know precisely the bioaugmentation process you mean, but if you're looking at adding things to it's kind of a band-aid approach, in the sense that it may make the system look a little bit better. You can buy these things called aqua dyes that stain the water and reduce the light penetration, and therefore reduce the ability of cyanobacteria to grow. But I would never advise that you dye your lake in order to make it look blue. I would advise that you fix the problem with the excess nutrients coming in, and that will improve it to the extent it can. I will say the thing to bear in mind is these lakes have always had cyanobacteria, at least for 500 years. That's as far back as we've gone in the Qu'Appelle lakes. So perfectly clear water, probably not natural in the middle of summer. They've probably always been relatively green. And even the explorers' records, when they came through, you can see the translation say it's pretty green. So I guess my thinking is I'd rather see a solution that was based on addressing the problem rather than the consequences of the problem.
Okay, good. So Brian Klaschinski, I see you've got your hand up. I'll unmute you if you want to unmute yourself and ask Peter a question. Are you there, Brian? Okay.
Scared him off.
Sorry, I might have. Brian, are you there? Hello? Okay, I see David Hubick has his hand up. David, did you want to ask Peter a question?
Hi, Peter. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying Ireland. I did notice audio was a little bit worse during the lecture. You seem to be good now, so maybe it is even a bit of mic positioning or something like that. I don't know, but it's been good. Did want to ask, and it was kind of asked a little bit already, but maybe just to add on to it. I'd always thought maybe the major input to the nutrient that was getting into the lakes was agricultural runoff, but it doesn't sound like that's as much as maybe as I thought. Is that main source then like human wastewater from our cities? And then maybe to tie that back to a specific lake, because you said it kind of depends on where. The one that I'm making note of is where I spent time as a kid was Knossi Lake, which didn't seem bad when I was a kid in the 80s, but was pretty bad when I was there, maybe in the 2010 time frame. So maybe two questions then. Is it or poop? And what do you think of Qu'Appelle? Thank you.
Sure. So the first one is, again, it depends on the lake. I've studied mostly the Qu'Appelle lakes, and their human activities have been the most important thing up until this point. Other lakes that don't have wastewater input, it can't be wastewater. And so in those instances, with the lakes excessively green, then it has to be some other activity. And I think farming's it's not so much that it's farming per se. I think it's just problems with fertilization being applied either at the wrong time or in excess of the plant demanded. The farmers are in a battle. They want to put no more nutrient on than they need, but there's a bit of guesswork because of climate and weather and that, and so you don't always know how much you need to add, and so you sometimes,
it's hard to get it right.
You cheat it up a little bit, and when you do that, if you get it wrong, you can have a significant release. With respect to Qu'Appelle, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually have a paper on my desk about Qu'Appelle and White Bear Lake that we're working on right now. So in the case of Qu'Appelle, at least part of the problem has been pretty major changes in lake level, and these seem to be mostly climate driven. So the lake was about 8 meters higher at the start of the 20th century, and then it dropped down to really quite low levels. Actually, looking at the chart on my table, sort of the mid 2000s, and then it's come back up again more recently. As the lake concentrates due to evaporation, the nutrients that are in it become more same amount of nutrients, less water, so there's a higher concentration of nutrients, and it's the concentration that the algae are responding to. So at least partly, I would say that the lake is getting somewhat greener as the water level goes down. Given that it started to go up again, it's possible that the situation will resolve itself. That is, the water quality will improve a little bit. Having said that, cottaging is a continuous thing in around the lake. There's not much land use beyond that. So I would say that if I were looking at things to address with the nutrients, I would look at the local cottaging as a potential source of nutrients, maybe do a nutrient budget to figure out whether that's really important. And then you're just going to have to put up a little bit with the climate variability.
Okay, thank you, David and Peter. I'm not seeing a question from Brian. We got one more question here. Peter, can you comment on the recent study, I guess, that looked at nutrient sources within the Qu'Appelle non-point and point? And I believe under that, most of the pollution or nutrients were coming from non-point. So
Yep.
So is it that we have a real problem with our cities, and we know we do, or is it a question of now non-point is becoming the big issue?
It's the latter. I mean, the thing is, the city of Regina was about 70% of total nutrient inputs to the Qu'Appelle through most of the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s. And it remained that in terms of nitrogen inputs. With the wastewater upgrade, they've knocked back the total nitrogen by somewhere in the order of 90%. And so the nitrogen from the city is quite a bit lower fraction of the total nutrient input than it was even 5 years ago. So if you're doing your nutrient budget now, the city used to be almost all the story, and now it's a relatively small part of the story. So this is a case of, it's not a different story, it's that the story's evolving. So yes, now we start looking at what the other sources of nutrients are. Are they related to wetlands loss? Are they related to livestock getting access to the inflow creeks because they get into the water, they defecate in the water prodigiously, and they chew up the bank, they destroy the riparian zone, the near shore zone, which acts as this biofilter. Plus you've got one of the challenges in the prairies, I know this is going to come as a complete shock to people, but they're flat. And so what that means is if you get a little bit of water, it tends to just go down. It tends to be absorbed or infiltrate into the soils. Get a little bit more water, it tends to run across. Get a little bit more water, and all of a sudden you got a flood. And the multiplier of having these very, very large drainage areas or catchment areas is a bit of a problem when you're trying to control diffuse nutrient inputs. In a dry year, there's hardly any nutrients coming in because there's hardly any water coming off the landscape. In a wet year, it's a torrent, it's a deluge of nutrients. And the problem is the water gets into the lake and it just sort of stays there for a while. And the residence time of the water, the time the water stays in the lake is much longer than the length of time needed to grow lots of little round green things. And so you get into this problem where you get this large contributing area with very profound changes in the nutrient cycle, if there's any tillage going on, or even if there's not, if there's fertilizer application, or there's intensive livestock, all of these things will become more and more important. You know, I think if the city continues to innovate and the other towns and areas that were formerly small sources of nutrients that are now larger sources of nutrients follow suit and get proper wastewater treatment and don't just use the lagoon system that gets dumped into the creek anytime it's full, then you're going to see an increasing focus on land use practices because you still have too much algae in the water. You've eliminated some of the big sources. You have to be patient about the recovery rates, but you have eliminated the big sources. Now you can start looking at the medium level sources.
Great, thanks. Lynn, did you have a question or a comment? Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay. I don't know, I've lost you, but I'm going to make this comment and hope you can hear it. I was tremendously interested in what you had to say, Peter, and I was annoyed at the problems we were having with the audio. The first thing I want to do is check our recordings. If by any chance our recordings are clearer, I would certainly want to put out a memo to all the participants indicating that they could avail themselves of the recordings to review, because that's what I intend to do, because I was so very interested. And while I'm here talking, I will say on behalf of Parks, thank you, Peter, for coming all the way from across the ocean, where you had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and really show us that this is a very complicated, and you gave us a but yet you gave us an in-depth overview. I feel I learned a lot. Thanks so much.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm sorry about the sound. It's entirely possible it's my throat mic because I tend to gesture like this and it bounces around. Yeah, the funny thing is I'm going to be in Regina in 3 days. Well, once I'm through quarantine, I'll be in Regina, but I'm coming back on Saturday. It's just the timing was such that I'm still here. I thought I was going to be back, but it's not the case.
Okay, I don't think there's one. You had time for one more question, Peter? Someone asked.
Yeah, I'm fine.
John asked, do you consider nutrients that may get into the lake by excessive wakeboard and ski boat activities that cause wave actions onto the shoreline of the lakes as inputs?
I wouldn't consider them as new nutrients. So, but it is possible that you can have erosion of shoreline, and that instability can introduce nutrients that sort of get into the lake more slowly, but they're already sort of there to begin with. They're part of the lake ecosystem. I honestly, I kind of doubt that wakeboarding is a significant source of nutrients relative to land use or human activities that actually manipulate the nutrients themselves. But there's other reasons why you might want to protect the lakeshore from wave action, and you know, there's a tendency for people to clear out things like wooden stumps or weeds because they're not fun to swim in. I get it. But unfortunately, those are the habitats that fish often live in and breed in. And so by removing that habitat, you adjust or change the species of fish, not necessarily to one that you want, game fish. And so there's other reasons to be more concerned, or at least aware of the nearshore environment. There's been a fair bit of work done in the States about trying to protect what's called the riparian zone, the nearshore environment, and that includes into the water. And things like putting logs back in the lake. I know that sounds really weird, but shallow water gets really warm. Fish often, certain species of fish will lay their eggs in there, and they often will use the shadow underneath a substrate or a structure in order to shade the eggs. Similarly, some little fish hide from the big fish in there. And if they can't hide because there's no structure, that has an effect on who can live in the lake. So kind of a long answer, but the upshot is I don't think it's a big nutrient source. It certainly wouldn't be in my top 3 of things to worry about. But there are other reasons why you might want to reduce wave action anyway.
Okay, perfect. So we have one last question here. Brian did get a question in. So what suggestions would you have, Peter, to encourage the governing bodies to get more excited about initiating and funding programs that can affect meaningful change to lake bodies, specifically talking about Humboldt Lake?
Well, there's the $6 million question, isn't it? It doesn't seem to be a provincial priority of the government. We'll say that. I think there's lip service paid to it, but there's several signs that a better job could be done. The 25-year water plan, I mean, it's good in the sense that it says let's not make it worse than it is at present, but it takes the present, or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, present, as an acceptable state. And I would maintain that most of the lakes are degraded. A lot of the lakes are degraded, notably from their historical condition. And so taking the modern condition as an acceptable starting point and not making it worse seems like a sort of a weak goal. It's difficult in a province in which farming is such an important part of the social landscape to talk about restrictions on farming, because the farmers, for some good reason, feel like they're doing the right thing. They're producing food for people, and their margins are small because the value of crops haven't really increased, in pace of inflation. So they feel that they're being hard done by. And when somebody like me comes up and says, "Oh, it's that hippie from Regina who he always says it's farming or this or that," I mean, I get it. I understand the problem. The difficulty is it's not a farm, it's all farms. Because it's such a large area, it's going to take an aggregate approach to really address this. And I don't have a silver bullet. I mean, I think being involved, and like Parks is doing, and educating people and tapping on, instead of waiting for an election and the politician to come from you, tap on their door and say, look, we're really concerned about this. In the case of Humboldt, I mean, you have clear evidence of nutrient pollution. There's really just one source of it there, or at least there'd be the main source. And you can just say, this is unacceptable. It's a health risk. And that's a reasonable strategy. And I think in instances where the environmental degradation has gotten to the point that you get these toxic algal blooms, then you have reason to say there's a health risk. And that's probably a pretty good motivator for most governments. But it's disappointing that it has to come to a threat to population health before people will move on things. The way I've described it is, if you want clear water tomorrow, forget it. It is not going to happen. The lakes have a lot of stored nutrients. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts here that are going to prevent that kind of recovery. So don't make that your goal. make your goal better water quality in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. Make the environment one that your kids can go out and go swimming in without getting a mouthful of blue-green algae. Then I think you have reasonable prospect of making it better. The difficulty is that's not a political time frame of relevance. You know, it's not an electoral cycle. It's going to take real vision to say we want a Saskatchewan that's better than it is now, because the inference is it's somehow wrong now. I think you can just say, you know, water quality is not good. It should be better. It can be better. Let's take the long view and figure out how to get there in 30, 40, 50 years.
Great, good comments. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, you can't see the thought bubble in my head. This is a point of frustration for me. I mean, it took us better part of 20 years to convince the city to upgrade their wastewater, we being scientists. And I would say that our effect was more indirect, that by doing the research that we've done on the Qu'Appelle, showing the effects of nitrogen pollution, it convinced federal policy makers to change the laws with regards to ammonia and other nitrogen sources, and that then cascaded down to the city and forced the city's hand. I thought it was, you know, I think it's sometimes frustrating. That said, I understand that policymakers and decision makers, they've got other things to do with their times. Environment is not their only portfolio. And you know, in my classes, I'll say, you know, the job of the scientist is to inform decision. It's not my, you know, if there's a decision taken to pave over, fill in Wascana Lake in Regina and put up a children's hospital, okay? There's a pro and a con to both sides. I can't tell you whether that's a good decision, but I can tell you what will happen to the environment should you decide to go down that route. And I think if we have good government, and we have government for the people, by the people, for the people, then we have the chance of influencing the decisions by applying science, by applying public interest to get a decision or to get a response that's good for everybody. And this is where, you know, just to finish up, this is where I feel the treaty rights are really important. Treaties are for everybody, right? They're to share the land. And that means sharing means not experiencing a tragedy of the commons where you all use the same resource and you all say, oh, it's their fault. I don't have to do this. And you end up with a degraded environment because nobody took responsibility. Treaty requires us to take responsibility. And so I think we have an opportunity to do something with that now.
Good, that was very insightful, Peter. So I guess with that, you can't see it, but there are lots of comments, lots of thank yous, and great discussion and great information. So so you'll hear a virtual applause for your presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn for the closing comments.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Lynn.
Good, because somehow my face isn't there, which is probably probably better anyway. I speak as a grandma who would like to think that my grandchildren's children would enjoy the lakes like I did when I was a little girl. And I am so conscious of the fact that the lakes don't belong to the cottage owners along the shores, but the cottage owners along the shores, I feel, have an added obligation to be caretakers of those lakes. And I hope that I can revisit your words on the tape and put out a good newsletter about it, because what you had to say was memorable. Thank you, Peter.
You're very welcome. I mean, you make a really important point, which is one of environmental stewardship. And the reason stewardship is so important is it arises from the institution of slavery, which is not a good thing. But a steward was a person in the household whose job it was to sustain the household and nourish the household without actually owning anything in it. And that's very much our lives, you know, whether we're beside the lake or we're upstream of the lake or we're downstream of the lake. It's our obligation, I think, as a society to protect the environment. So I mean, I completely agree with you. And